He didn't ask. He didn't wait. He just pointed his finger directly at a 10-year-old girl sitting quietly in first class and said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "Move, that's my seat." The little girl looked up, blinked once, and without flinching held up her boarding pass. He snatched it, glanced at it, and handed it back with a smirk. "I don't care what that says. You don't belong here." Not one adult stepped forward, not one voice rose. And in that silence, something irreversible was set into motion because no one on that plane yet knew who this child was or whose daughter she had the quiet dignity of being. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Part 1. The flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. was supposed to be routine. Gate B-14 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was humming the way it always did on a Tuesday morning, carry-on bags rolling across tile toddlers, crying at departure boards, business travelers typing furiously on laptops, balanced on their knees. Nothing about the scene was unusual. Nothing, except for the small girl sitting perfectly still at the end of a row of gate chairs, a navy blue backpack on her lap, her posture so composed it almost looked practiced. Her name was Ava Carter. She was 10 years old, and she was flying alone. She wasn't scared, though. Or if she was, she had learned long ago how to carry fear the way some people carry car keys quietly in a pocket where no one else can see it. Her mother had spent 3 nights going over everything, 3 nights of dry runs and laminated checklists and role-playing scenarios at the kitchen table after dinner. What do you do if someone asks where your parents are? I tell them I'm an unaccompanied minor and I ask to speak with a flight attendant. What do you do if you feel unsafe? I don't raise my voice. I don't argue. I find an adult in uniform. And what's the most important thing? Her mother had looked at her steadily when she asked that last one, and Ava had answered without hesitation. Know my worth, even when they try to make me forget it. Dr. Maya Carter did not put her daughter on that plane without preparation. She had called the airline 4 times. She had spoken to the unaccompanied minor coordinator, confirmed the escort service from check-in to gate, double-checked that Ava's seat in 2A first-class window left side was properly noted in the system. She had paid the premium. Not because she needed the comfort, but because first class meant proximity to the flight attendants. It meant eyes on her daughter. It meant someone would be within reach of Ava for the entire 2-hour flight. What Dr. Carter had not accounted for, could not have accounted for, was Richard Whitman. He arrived at the gate 11 minutes before boarding, closed, rolling a leather carry-on that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. His blazer slightly wrinkled from what looked like an earlier flight. He was the kind of man who moved through spaces like he had already claimed them, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the room, not with curiosity, but with calculation, the practiced confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life been told to wait. He was in his mid-50s with the kind of tan you get from golf courses rather than sunshine, and a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. He had diamond status with the airline. He had flown 142 segments the previous year. He kept those numbers close the way some men keep trophies. He boarded early because diamond status gets you that, and he walked down the jet bridge with his phone pressed to his ear, only half listening to whoever was on the other end, his eyes moving to the seat numbers overhead as he stepped into the first-class cabin. He stopped. He looked down at the aisle seat beside the window. He looked at Ava. She was sitting with her backpack settled on her lap, her seatbelt already buckled, a small notebook open on top of the bag. She had been drawing something, a bird maybe, or the beginnings of one, and she glanced up when she noticed the shadow fall over her. He stared at her for a moment that lasted just a beat too long. Then he said, "Move." Just that. One word. No greeting, no question, no explanation. Ava looked at him with the particular calm of a child who has been taught to pause before she reacts. "I'm sorry." "This is my seat," he said louder this time, like she might not have heard him the first time. "Move along." She reached into the front pocket of her backpack without hurrying and pulled out her boarding pass. She held it out toward him. "I'm in 2A, she said. "See, it's right there." He took it from her fingers. He looked at it. He handed it back. "I don't care what that says." And then he said something that would later be repeated on every major news network in the country, something that witnesses would recount in interviews and comment sections for weeks to come. He looked down at this 10-year-old girl, this quiet, composed, dignified child, and he said, "You don't belong here." She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just looked at him with those steady brown eyes and said very quietly, "My boarding pass says I do." 2 rows back, a woman named Dorothy Webb was watching. She was 72 years old, a retired elementary school principal from Birmingham, Alabama, and she had spent 4 decades of her professional life learning how to read a room. She read this one in about 4 seconds. She set down her crossword puzzle. She did not look away. A flight attendant named James Calloway had been at the forward galley when the exchange began. He was 29 years old, lean quick, with the kind of situational awareness that good flight attendants develop after a few years on the job. He heard the tone before he heard the words. He stepped out. "Sir," James said, moving toward the row with a measured smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Can I help you find your seat?" Richard Whitman turned to face him. "This child is in my seat. Can I see your boarding pass?" There was a pause. Something flickered across Whitman's face. Not embarrassment, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The brief, involuntary hesitation of a man who knows what the document is going to say, but hasn't yet decided how he's going to handle it. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the pass. James looked at it, looked at the seat number on the overhead panel, looked back at the pass. "Sir, you're in 2B, the aisle seat." Silence. Whitman took the boarding pass back without responding. He looked at the seat. He looked at Ava. He looked at the seat again, as if the problem were architectural rather than personal, as if the universe had made a clerical error that still needed correcting. "I want the window seat," he said finally. James kept his voice level. "I understand, sir, but this young lady is already seated in 2A, and that is her assigned seat. You're welcome to take 2B. "She's a child. She doesn't care about the window. Do you care about the window?" He turned to Ava directly, as if appealing to her sense of accommodation might work where authority had not. "You'd rather have the aisle anyway, right? More room to stretch." Ava looked at him for a moment. "No, thank you," she said. "I like the window." There was a sound from the row behind, something between a breath and a laugh quickly suppressed. Dorothy was looking straight ahead now, but her jaw had tightened just slightly. Whitman's face did something complicated. The muscles around his mouth rearranged themselves into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be read as the practiced, dangerous pleasantness of a man who has learned that anger makes him look bad, but condescension still feels like power. "Listen," he said to James, dropping his voice slightly, shifting into a tone that implied he was being reasonable, conspiratorial, even man to man. "I fly this route every week. I have diamond status. I'm sure there's something you can do." James clasped his hands in front of him. "I appreciate your loyalty to the airline, sir. I genuinely do. But the seating assignments are fixed, and this passenger is an unaccompanied minor, which means her seat assignment cannot be changed without explicit authorization. She stays in 2A. The word minor seemed to register on Whitman's face in a new way. His eyes moved back to Ava, really looked at her, this time maybe for the first time. And whatever calculation he ran in that moment did not produce the outcome he wanted, because he straightened up and said with brittle authority, "I want to speak to your supervisor." "Of course," James said. "I'll get Patricia." He walked back toward the galley. Whitman stood in the aisle, one hand on the overhead bin, like he was making sure no one could forget he was still there, still unresolved, still very much a problem that needed solving. Other passengers were boarding now, stepping around him, some glancing over with the curious, careful attention of people who have noticed something is wrong, but haven't yet decided whether to become involved. Ava had gone back to her notebook. She was drawing again. The bird had wings now. Patricia Nguyen was the lead flight attendant 14 years with the airline, the kind of professional who moved through tension the way a surgeon moves through an operating room with economy, with precision, without broadcasting what she was about to do until she was already doing it. She came out of the galley with James 2 steps behind her, and she introduced herself to Whitman with a handshake that was firm, without being combative. "Mr. Whitman, I understand you have a concern about your seat." "I want the window." "I understand. Unfortunately, 2A is occupied by an unaccompanied minor whose seat assignment is documented and confirmed. We are not able to reassign her without parental authorization, which we do not have." "Then call the parent." Patricia held his gaze. "Sir, we are 12 minutes from the door closing. We are not going to call a parent to resolve a seating preference dispute. You are in 2B. That is your seat. I'm going to need you to take it." Something shifted in Whitman. Not surrender, not yet, but a recognition that the terrain had changed, that the tools that usually worked were not working, and that he needed to recalibrate. He sat down. He put his bag in the overhead bin. He clicked his seatbelt. He did not look at Ava. But the thing about small cabins is that they don't allow for real retreats. He was 6 inches from her, and in that proximity something simmered. The other passengers could feel it. Dorothy could feel it. She watched Whitman the way she used to watch the difficult parents at parent-teacher conferences, the ones who smiled too broadly and held their grievances just below the surface, waiting for the right moment to bring them back up. Boarding completed. The door closed. The safety demonstration began. James moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, and when he passed row 2, he glanced at Ava. She looked up. He gave her a small nod, the kind that says, "I see you, you're okay." She gave him one back. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxied to the runway. The engine noise built, and for a few minutes it genuinely seemed like the whole thing might be over. It was not over. Somewhere over North Carolina, Whitman shifted in his seat and turned to Ava with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who had been nursing a grievance at altitude. "You know," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "your mother probably thought she was doing something nice for you, putting you up here." He gestured vaguely at the cabin. "But this isn't really where kids like you belong. It makes people uncomfortable." Ava put her pencil down. She looked at him. "Kids like me," she said. He looked away. "You know what I mean." "I don't think I do," she said. "Can you explain it?" He didn't answer, and somehow his silence was more damning than anything else he could have said. Dorothy Webb, who had been pretending to read her crossword puzzle but had not filled in a single box in the last 40 minutes, set it down on her tray table. She leaned forward. She tapped Whitman lightly on the shoulder. He turned. "I just want you to know," Dorothy said with the exquisite, devastating courtesy of a 72-year-old Southern woman who has run out of patience for nonsense, "that I heard everything you just said to that child, and I want you to know that I intend to remember it." Whitman stared at her. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Dorothy said pleasantly, and went back to her crossword. It was the moment the cabin changed. Not dramatically, there were no gasps, no immediate uproar, but the people within earshot had heard it. A man in 3A stopped scrolling his phone. A woman across the aisle looked over. Awareness moved through the first-class section like a current, quiet and electric. James Calloway had been watching from the galley. He had not heard the second exchange. Whitman had been careful about that, but he had seen Dorothy's gesture, seen Whitman's response, seen the way Ava's hands had gone still in her lap. He came down the aisle. "Is everything all right?" he asked, directing the question toward Ava. She looked up at him. For the first time since the whole thing began, her composure showed its edges not dramatically, not in tears, but in the faintest tightening around her eyes, the smallest possible admission that she was tired. "He said something to me," she said quietly. "Something about kids like me." James looked at Whitman. "Sir," he said, and his voice had changed. It had the same professional courtesy as before, but something underneath it had hardened, the way metal hardens under cold. "I'm going to need to ask you to refrain from directing any further comments toward this passenger. I was making conversation. I understand. Please don't. The man in 3A had his phone out now. He was being subtle about it, angling it carefully, but James saw it and said nothing. What happened on this plane was going to happen. He could feel it the way you feel weather coming. He went back to the galley, picked up the interphone, and called the cockpit. "Captain," he said, "I think you need to know what's happening in the cabin." Captain Daniel Reeves was 51 years old, a former Air Force pilot, 23 years with the airline, and one of those people who carried authority so naturally that it didn't need announcing. When he emerged from the cockpit 15 minutes later, the cabin did not erupt. He didn't make an entrance. He simply walked down the aisle with his hands clasped behind his back, paused at row 2, and crouched down so that he was level with Ava. "Hi there," he said. "I'm Captain Reeves. What's your name?" "Ava," she said. "Ava. That's a good name." He looked at her for a moment, taking in the boarding pass still sitting on her tray table, the notebook with the half-finished bird, the composure that was costing her more than she was showing. "I heard there was some trouble with your seat." He said, "I don't belong here." Captain Reeves didn't look at Whitman. Not yet. He kept his eyes on Ava. "He was wrong," he said simply. "You have a ticket, you have a seat, you belong exactly where you are." He paused. "Has anyone gotten you something to drink? Something to eat?" "No." He stood up. He turned to face Whitman. The cabin had gone very, very quiet. "Sir," Captain Reeves said, and his voice was not loud, was not theatrical, was not performing for anyone. "I've been made aware that you directed comments toward this child that were inappropriate and unwelcome. I need to be direct with you. My crew and I take the safety and dignity of every passenger on this aircraft seriously. Every passenger. Do you understand me?" Whitman's jaw tightened. "I was just making conversation." "That conversation is over," Captain Reeves said. He waited. He was the kind of man who could wait indefinitely, who used silence the way a scalpel uses precision. "I'm going to ask you directly, do you intend to create any further disruption on this flight?" A long pause. "No," Whitman said. "Good." Captain Reeves looked at him for one more beat, then turned back to Ava. "Patricia is going to bring you something. You let us know if you need anything else." "All right." Ava looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. The applause started from 3B. Just one pair of hands, initially the man who had his phone out. Then Dorothy, unhurried, deliberate, clicking her hands together with the satisfaction of someone who has waited a long time to do exactly this. Then someone behind her. Then two more. Not a roar. This wasn't a movie, but something real. Something that moved through the cabin row by row, the sound of people who had watched and waited, and were finally releasing what they'd been holding. Whitman stared straight ahead. His hands were in his lap. His face had done something strange, gone very still, the way faces go still when the strategy has failed, and there is nothing left to perform. Ava picked up her pencil. She looked at the bird she'd been drawing. She gave it a second wing. Outside the window, somewhere over Virginia, the clouds broke open and the ground appeared below patchwork and distant and beautiful, and Ava pressed her face to the glass for just a moment, her breath fogging it slightly, and looked down at the world that had no idea what had just happened 30,000 feet above it. The man in 3A lowered his phone. He had 12 seconds of video. He did not yet know what he was going to do with it, but he had it. And some things once captured cannot be uncaptured. Patricia brought Ava a cup of apple juice and a warm cookie and set them on her tray table without a word. Then she stood up straight, smoothed her jacket, and walked back to the galley where James was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "You okay?" he asked her. "I've been better," she said. "And then, I've also been a lot worse." She looked back toward row 2 where Ava had turned back to her notebook, the cookie half-eaten, the apple juice already half gone. She didn't cry, James, that whole time. She didn't cry once. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. She didn't. Outside the galley window, the Maryland suburbs were beginning to appear below, spreading out in grids toward the capital. 20 minutes to landing.
The intercom chimed softly, the first officer announcing their descent. Seatbelt signs illuminated. The cabin adjusted, straightened, prepared.
Whitman said nothing for the rest of the flight. He did not look at Ava. He did not look at Dorothy. He did not look at Captain Reeves, who had returned to the cockpit. He stared at the seat back in front of him with the particular blank intensity of a man replaying a series of decisions and finding nowhere to put them. And Ava Carter, 10 years old, flying alone for the first time, sitting in seat 2A with her boarding pass and her backpack and her notebook and her half-finished bird. Ava Carter finished her drawing. She looked at it for a long moment. She tore it carefully from the notebook along the perforated edge, and she held it out to Dorothy. Dorothy took it. She looked at it. It was a bird, small, clean-lined wings spread wide, drawn with the particular confidence of a child who has decided the bird is going to fly and is not interested in argument. "This is beautiful," Dorothy said. Ava smiled. It was the first real smile she had shown since boarding. "You can keep it," she said. Dorothy folded it once along the center and slipped it into her crossword book. She was going to keep it for the rest of her life, though she didn't know that yet. She was going to show it to her granddaughter and tell this story, and her granddaughter was going to ask, "What happened next, Grandma?" And Dorothy was going to say, "Well, that's where it gets interesting." Because the plane was descending now. The runway lights of Reagan National Airport rising up through the gray Virginia afternoon. And no one on that plane, not Ava, not Dorothy, not James or Patricia or Captain Reeves, and certainly not Richard Whitman, had any idea that the 12 seconds of video in the pocket of the man in 3A was already in motion, already becoming something larger than any of them, already carrying a name that none of them had heard yet. The name Carter. The wheels touched down. The cabin exhaled. The seatbelt sign chimed off. And somewhere in Atlanta, a trauma surgeon's phone began to ring. The phone rang 4 times before Dr. Maya Carter answered it. She was still in scrubs. She had just come off a 9-hour shift that had started at 5 in the morning with a 43-year-old man who had been brought in without a pulse and ended somehow with him breathing on his own in recovery. She was standing in the hospital parking garage with her keys in her hand, her feet aching, her mind beginning the slow descent from surgeon mode into something softer, something that could think about dinner and whether Ava had remembered to take her allergy medication. Then her phone buzzed, and the screen said, "The airline's unaccompanied minor desk." She answered immediately. "This is Dr. Carter." The voice on the other end was professionally calm, in the way that people are calm when they are trying not to alarm you while also alarming you. "Dr. Carter, this is Sandra from our unaccompanied minor services team. I'm calling to let you know that Ava has landed safely at Reagan National and is currently with our ground escort team." "Okay," Maya said. "Good. Is she all right?" A pause. Just a half second. But Maya Carter had spent 20 years reading the pauses between heartbeats, and she heard it. "There was an incident on board," Sandra said. "Ava is physically fine. She is safe. But I want to make sure you're aware before she calls you herself." Maya's keys stopped rattling. Her hand had gone still. "What kind of incident?" It was not a question. It was a surgeon's precision wrapped in a mother's dread. Sandra explained it carefully with the measured language of someone who had clearly been coached on what to say and how to say it. A passenger. A dispute over seating. Ava handled it calmly. The crew intervened. The captain himself came out. Everything was resolved. Everything was fine. Maya listened without saying a word. She let Sandra finish. Then she said very quietly, "He told my daughter she didn't belong there. We are deeply sorry for..." He told my 10-year-old daughter in front of a full first-class cabin that she didn't belong in her seat. Her voice had not risen. It hadn't needed to. There was something in it that was worse than volume, a flatness, a clarity, the sound of a woman who has heard injustice enough times in her life to know exactly what shape it takes. "I paid for that seat. I documented her trip. I called your airline 4 times to make sure she would be safe. 4 times. And a grown man sat down next to my child and told her she didn't belong. Dr. Carter, I want to assure you that the passenger has been flagged, and what is his name?" Silence. I'm not able to share that information at this. What is his name? Sandra did not share the name. What she did instead was transfer Maya to a senior customer experience manager named Gerald, who had a deeper voice and a more polished script, and who ultimately told Maya the same things in more expensive language. The crew had handled it well. The airline took these matters seriously. There would be a follow-up. There would be a review. There would be communication within 72 hours. Maya said, "I want to speak to the captain." Gerald said that wasn't a service the airline could arrange directly. Maya said, "Then I'll find another way." And she hung up. She sat in her car for 60 seconds. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She just sat with both hands on the steering wheel and breathed the deliberate, measured breathing she used in trauma bays when the situation was critical and panic was a luxury no one could afford. She gave herself 60 seconds. Then she started the car and drove to Reagan National Airport. Ava was in a small room near the gate when Maya arrived. It was one of those airport rooms that exist for logistics rather than comfort. A couple of chairs, a table, a water cooler, a woman in an airline blazer sitting across from Ava with a clipboard. Ava had her backpack on her lap. She was eating the second half of the cookie Patricia had given her on the plane, and when the door opened and Maya walked in, she looked up, and her face did something it had not done for the entire flight. It crumbled. Just for a second, a single full second of the 10-year-old that she actually was the child underneath the composure, the girl who had held it together across 2 states and 30,000 feet, and 2 hours of quiet, determined dignity. She set down the cookie. She stood up, and Maya crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her daughter into her arms and held on. The woman with the clipboard quietly closed her notebook. "I'm okay," Ava said into Maya's shoulder. "I know you are," Maya said. "I know." "I didn't argue. I showed him my boarding pass. I did what you said." "I know, baby. I know you did." "He said I didn't belong there." Maya tightened her arms. "He was wrong," she said. And then the same words Captain Reeves had used, though she didn't know that yet. "You belong exactly where you are." They stayed like that for a long moment, mother and daughter in a room that smelled like recycled air and burned coffee, and the woman with the clipboard did not rush them. She was a grandmother herself. She knew what this was. When they finally separated, Ava wiped her face with the back of her hand and straightened up. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her notebook. "I drew something," she said. "I gave one to the old lady on the plane, but I made another one." She held it out. It was another bird, same wingspan, same confident lines, but this one had a small detail the first one didn't. A shadow below it, faint and careful. The suggestion of something beneath it, the ground far below. Maya looked at it for a long time. "What's the shadow?" she asked. Ava thought about it. "It's still flying," she said. "Even with a shadow, it doesn't change anything." Maya folded it and put it carefully in her jacket pocket. Then she stood up, smoothed her scrubs, and turned to the woman with the clipboard with the particular quiet authority of someone who has just made a decision. "I need the incident report," she said. "Every detail. The passenger's name, his seat number, the names of the crew members involved, and the name of your senior operations manager on duty today." The woman blinked. "I can get you, and I need it tonight," Maya said. "Not in 72 hours. 3 hours later, the video went live. The man in 3A had gone back and forth for most of the day. His name was Marcus Webb, no relation to Dorothy, though they had exchanged numbers in the baggage claim when Dorothy had learned he had the video. He was 38 years old, a freelance photographer from D.C., and he had 12 seconds of footage that he had already watched 40 times on the cab ride home. In it, you could see Whitman standing in the aisle. You could see Ava's small hand holding out the boarding pass. You could hear Whitman's voice, not clearly, but enough saying something, and then you could see Ava's face as she heard it. That was what Marcus kept coming back to. Her face. The complete, devastating stillness of it. The absence of surprise. He captioned it simply. A grown man just told a 10-year-old girl she didn't belong in first class. The crew handled it. "Watch her face," and he posted it. By midnight, it had 400,000 views. By the time Maya Carter woke up the next morning at 6:15, her phone had 47 missed calls. She stood in her kitchen in the gray early light and scrolled through them with the slow disbelief of someone watching something unfold in a language they recognized but weren't expecting to be speaking today. News producers, radio stations, a producer from a national morning show, 3 separate journalists who had somehow found her direct number, and a voicemail from a woman named Dorothy Webb, 72, retired Birmingham, Alabama, who said in a voice both gentle and precise, "Dr. Carter, I was on that plane. I sat 2 rows behind your daughter. I want you to know that she was the most composed, dignified child I have ever seen in 60 years of watching children. And I want you to know that if you decide to do something about this, I will stand right beside you." Maya played that voicemail twice. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened her laptop. The video had 11 million views. She watched it, all 12 seconds of it. She watched her daughter hold out that boarding pass. She watched Whitman's face. She watched Ava's face, that stillness, that terrible, beautiful stillness. And she understood what everyone else who had watched 11 million times already understood. This was not about a seat. It had never been about a seat. Her phone rang again. It was her colleague, Dr. Renata Singh, calling from the hospital. "Maya," Renata said without preamble, "are you watching the news?" "I'm watching the video. They're about to say her name on the morning shows. They don't know who she is yet. They're calling her the little girl. But Maya, it's everywhere. It is everywhere." Maya set down her coffee. "Has anyone from the airline called?" "I don't know. But honey, you should know people are angry, like genuinely, viscerally angry. The comments are people are looking for the man's name. They haven't found it yet, but they're looking." "I know his name," Maya said quietly. A pause. "What are you going to do?" Maya looked at the laptop screen. At the 12 seconds frozen on her daughter's face, patient and still, and holding out that boarding pass like an act of small, enormous courage. "I'm going to make sure this means something," she said. She was still at the kitchen table when Ava came downstairs, 20 minutes later, school backpack over one shoulder still in her socks. She stopped when she saw her mother's face. "What's wrong?" Maya turned the laptop around so Ava could see it. Ava looked at the screen, at the video, at herself, small and serious in seat 2, A holding out the boarding pass to a man twice her height. She watched it without expression. When it ended, she looked at her mother. "Someone filmed it," Ava said. "Yes." "How many people have seen it?" Maya took a breath. "A lot of people, baby." Ava was quiet for a moment. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. She looked at the number under the video. She blinked once. "That's a lot," she said. "It is. Are they mad at him or at me?" The question hit Maya somewhere low in the chest. The fact that Ava had asked it, that she had needed to ask it, was its own kind of answer about the world she had been growing up in. "At him," Maya said firmly. "They're angry at him, Ava, because what he did was wrong, and people see that." Ava nodded slowly. She looked at the screen a moment longer, then looked at her mother. "Is he going to be in trouble?" "I don't know yet." "Good," Ava said, with a simplicity that was not cruelty, but something cleaner, a child's unvarnished sense of consequence, the belief not yet worn down by experience that wrong actions should produce wrong results. He should be. Maya's phone rang again. She looked at it, a number she didn't recognize with a Washington, D.C. area code. She answered it on instinct, the same way she answered codes in the ER. "Dr. Carter," said the voice on the other end. It was male, measured with the deliberate composure of someone who has been in damage control meetings since before the sun came up. "This is David Morse, Chief Communications Officer for the airline. I want to begin by personally apologizing for what happened aboard that flight, and I want to have a direct conversation with you about how we intend to—" "Mr. Morse," Maya said. "Before you say anything else, I want you to know that I am recording this call." A beat. Just a small one. Of course, Morse said. Good. Now, my daughter is 10 years old. She is an unaccompanied minor who traveled with your airline under protocols I arranged in advance in a seat I paid for with documentation your staff confirmed. A passenger verbally harassed her, told her she didn't belong in her seat, and then when the immediate crew intervention was concluded, leaned over and told her that children like her made people uncomfortable. I want you to tell me what action your airline is taking. Not in a statement, not in a press release, right now on this call? Morse cleared his throat. We are conducting a full review of, is the passenger being banned? A longer pause this time. That determination is part of the review process which requires Mr. Morse. Maya's voice dropped not in volume, but in temperature the way a room drops when a window opens in January. The video has 11 million views, and it is 9 o'clock in the morning. By this afternoon, it will have 30 million. I am a trauma surgeon. I saved 31 lives in this airport 14 months ago during a mass shooting, and I have never once asked anyone for anything in return. I am asking now. I am asking you to do the right thing for my daughter, and I am telling you clearly that I will be watching to see whether you do. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. I'll call you back within the hour, Morse said. I'll be here, Maya said, and hung up. Ava had been listening from across the table. She was looking at her mother with an expression that was hard to name, something between awe and recognition, the look of a child seeing a parent operate at full capacity. For the first time, understanding in a new way that the person who packed her lunch and checked her homework and reminded her to take her allergy medication was also in some other register formidable. Mom, she said. Yeah, you sound like Captain Reeves. Maya looked at her daughter, and for the first time since she had walked into that airport room and pulled Ava into her arms, she laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised and entirely genuine. Good, she said. He seemed to know what he was doing. The call back from David Morse came in 44 minutes, not 60. The airline was issuing a formal public apology. The passenger, Richard Whitman, was being placed on the airline's no-fly list, pending investigation. The 3 crew members who had intervened, James Calloway, Patricia Nguyen, and Captain Daniel Reeves, were being formally commended. And the airline was requesting a meeting with Maya at her earliest convenience to discuss policy changes for unaccompanied minors. Maya wrote it all down. She read it back to make sure she had it right. Then she said, "One more thing." "Of course," Morse said. "I want to speak to Captain Reeves." Another pause, this one shorter. "I think that can be arranged." She got the call that afternoon. He had the same voice she had imagined from the way Ava had described him, steady and unhurried, without any theater in it. He told her what had happened in language that was simple and direct. He did not make it larger than it was. He did not minimize it either. He said he was sorry it had happened. He said Ava had carried herself with more grace than most adults he knew. He said at the end, "She's going to be okay, Dr. Carter. That kid is solid." Maya closed her eyes for a moment. "She learned it from her mother," Captain Reeves said quietly, and there was something in it that was not flattery, but something more real. The recognition of one professional for another, the acknowledgement that the calm Ava had shown was not accidental, was not just personality, was the inheritance of a woman who had spent 2 decades refusing to let hard rooms shake her. "Thank you," Maya said, "for what you did." "I was just doing my job," he said. "No," she said. "You were doing more than that." By evening, the story had a new layer. A journalist named Keisha Monroe, who covered civil rights and social justice for a national outlet, had done the research that no one else had thought to do yet. She had found Maya's name in a hospital press release from 14 months ago. She had found the story, the mass shooting at Hartsfield-Jackson, the trauma surgeon who had stayed for 19 consecutive hours, performing emergency surgeries, who had been photographed still in her scrubs at 3 in the morning with blood on her gloves and steady hands. She had found the number 31. 31 people who were alive because of Maya Carter's hands and will and refusal to walk away from a trauma bay until every patient was stable. She published the piece at 7:43 in the evening. It had a photograph of Maya from the hospital press release, tired, clear-eyed in scrubs, alongside the still from Marcus Webb's video of Ava holding the boarding pass. The headline read, "The surgeon who saved 31 lives and the daughter she couldn't protect at 30,000 feet." By 10 o'clock that night, the story had changed shape entirely. It was no longer just about a rude man on a plane. It was about what it costs to move through the world in a black body at any altitude, literal or figurative. It was about the exhaustion of having to prove again and again in airports and boardrooms and first-class cabins that you belong where the ticket says you belong. It was about a little girl who had learned that lesson before she was old enough to understand why she had to. Dorothy Webb saw the article from her living room in Birmingham. She read it twice, then she picked up her phone and called Marcus. "You saw it," she said. "Just finished reading it," he said. "They're going to want to talk to us, both of us." "I know." Dorothy looked at the bird drawing sitting on her side table. She had unfolded it when she got home, smoothed out the crease, and propped it against the lamp where she could see it. A small bird with wide wings and a shadow below it, still flying. "That little girl," Dorothy said softly. "She knew something, Marcus. She knew something the rest of us are still trying to figure out." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think she did." And somewhere across town in a hotel room he had booked on a corporate card, Richard Whitman sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his phone. He had not posted anything. He had not called anyone. His wife had texted him 3 times and he had not responded. He was watching the number under the video climb 22,023,023, climbing steadily, relentlessly, the way water climbs when the drain is blocked, and he was beginning to understand with the slow, nauseating clarity of a man watching something irreversible unfold, that 12 seconds had been enough, that the world had seen his face, and that the child he had dismissed in seat 2A had a name that was about to become a great deal more than he had bargained for. He turned off his phone. The room went quiet, but the number kept climbing. Richard Whitman turned his phone back on at 6:47 the next morning. He had told himself he wouldn't have made it 11 hours without it, which was the longest he had gone in probably a decade. But the silence had become its own kind of torment, a pressure that built in the dark until it was worse than whatever the screen would show him. So he turned it on, and he watched it load, and the first thing he saw was a text from his company's head of PR sent at 2 a.m. that said, simply, "Call me. Now. Emergency." His name had been found. He didn't know how exactly, and it didn't matter. Someone had recognized him from the video, a former colleague, a frequent flyer in the same elite tier, someone who had attended a conference where he had given a keynote, and whose memory for faces was inconveniently sharp. The name Richard Whitman had appeared in a tweet at 11:53 the previous night, attached to his LinkedIn profile photo, and from there it had detonated. By 6 a.m, it was in the comment sections of every major news outlet covering the story. By 6:30, it had its own trending thread. By the time he sat on the edge of that hotel bed, staring at his cracked open phone, his company's main customer service line had received over 4,000 emails overnight, and the hashtag attached to his name had been used more than 200,000 times. He called his PR head. Her name was Linda Chu, and she answered on the first ring, which told him everything about how bad it was before she said a single word. "Richard," she said. "Don't say anything publicly, not one word, not a text, not a tweet, not a statement to a journalist in an elevator, nothing. I need to explain what actually, Richard," her voice cut through clean and flat. "There are 26 million people who watched a video of you telling a 10-year-old girl she doesn't belong in her seat. There is no explanation. There is only response strategy, and right now the response strategy is silence while we assess." He was quiet. Outside his hotel window, Washington, D.C. was beginning its morning traffic, building the distant sound of a siren, the indifferent machinery of a city that had not paused for any of this. "How bad is it?" he asked. Linda took a breath. "Your company's board is calling an emergency session at 9. 3 of your largest clients have already reached out to the accounts team asking for clarification on the firm's values and leadership standards. And someone found the clip from the shareholders conference in 2019 where you made the comment about pipeline diversity being a box-checking exercise. The silence on Whitman's end lasted a long time. That's going to come out alongside this, Linda said. Everything is going to come out alongside this. That's how it works now. One video and they build a whole portrait. And right now, Richard, the portrait is not good. He hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand. And for the first time since he had pointed his finger at a 10-year-old girl and told her to move something in Richard Whitman's chest, shifted not into remorse, not yet, maybe not ever, but into something adjacent and equally unpleasant. The recognition that he had miscalculated, that the cabin of that plane which had felt so entirely familiar, so completely within his control, had not been a controlled environment at all, that someone had been watching, that someone was always watching, and that the world he had navigated so confidently for 54 years had quietly, fundamentally changed the rules without informing him. Meanwhile, 60 blocks north in a Georgetown townhouse, Keisha Monroe was already at her desk at 7:15, coffee going cold beside her keyboard, headphones on, working a second story that was building off the first. She had received 43 direct messages overnight from people who claimed to have personal experiences with Richard Whitman, former colleagues, subordinates, people who said they had watched him work a room and come away feeling smaller than when they entered. She was verifying each one methodically, the way she always did, cross-referencing, calling, asking for documentation. 2 had already produced emails. 1 had a voicemail she had listened to 3 times. Her editor, a compact, perpetually underslept man named Frank, appeared in her doorway at 7:30 with a mug in each hand. He set one on her desk without being asked. "Where are you?" he said. "Pattern," she said, not looking up. This wasn't the first time. It's never the first time. "How many sources?" "Well, 7 confirmed, 14 pending." Frank sat down in the chair across from her. "The Carter family, have they responded to interview requests?" Dr. Carter released a statement through the hospital's communications office this morning. Keisha pulled it up and read aloud. "My daughter traveled safely and is at home. I am grateful to the crew members who protected her. I am in communication with the airline. I have nothing further to say at this time." She set the laptop down. "She's not giving interviews." "Smart," Frank said. "Very smart." Keisha finally looked up. She knows she doesn't have to. The story is telling itself. It was. With a momentum that no single person was driving and no single platform was containing. By 9 o'clock that morning, the video had been shared by 6 senators, 2 governors, and a former president, each with their own, framing their own language, their own particular angle on what the 12 seconds represented. A civil rights organization had announced it was filing a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation. A children's advocacy group had issued a statement calling for federal guidelines on the treatment of unaccompanied minors. A law professor at Howard University had published a 6-paragraph thread about the legal dimensions of what had occurred, which had been shared 300,000 times. And inside a conference room at the airline's Atlanta headquarters, David Morse was standing at the head of a table, surrounded by people who all looked like they hadn't slept and whose faces carried the particular tight-jawed expression of professionals watching a crisis they had underestimated in real time. "Where are we on the Whitman ban confirmation?" someone asked. "Confirmed internally," said someone else. "Going in the public statement this afternoon." "The crew commendations." "Done. Patricia Nguyen, James Calloway, and Captain Daniel Reeves." "Written commendations, bonuses, personal calls from the CEO." "And Dr. Carter." Morse clasped his hands on the table. "We have a meeting with her tomorrow morning. She's bringing an attorney." The room absorbed that. The attorney detail was new information, and the way people adjusted in their seats made clear that it had landed with weight. "What does she want?" someone asked. Morse looked at the table for a moment. "She hasn't told us yet," he said. "That's what concerns me." What Maya Carter wanted was not at that point fully formed even in her own mind. She was sitting in her kitchen again. It had become, in the last 24 hours, the nerve center of something she hadn't asked to run with her attorney, a woman named Claudette Harris, who had been her college roommate, and who had spent the last 20 years doing civil rights litigation, with the quiet, relentless precision of someone who had never once mistaken patience for passivity. Claudette had flown in from Chicago that morning on the first available flight. She had a rolling suitcase, a legal pad already half filled, and the particular stillness of a woman who had been in rooms like this before and knew what they required. "Tell me everything," she had said when she sat down. "Start from when you booked the ticket." Maya told her everything. Claudette wrote without interrupting. When Maya finished, Claudette set down her pen and said, "Okay, I want to talk about what we're doing and why before we talk about what we're asking for, because what you're asking for is going to shape what this becomes, and what this becomes is important." Maya looked at her. "I know. You could ask for a settlement. Privately, you'd get it. With the media profile this has right now, they'd settle fast and quietly to make it stop. You'd walk away with something real, they'd issue an internal memo, and in 6 months, everything would be exactly the same." "That's not what I want." "I know," Claudette said. "So tell me what you do want." Maya was quiet for a moment. She thought about Ava coming downstairs with her backpack. She thought about the question her daughter had asked, "Are they mad at him or at me?" and the fact that a 10-year-old had needed to ask it. She thought about the 47 missed calls, and the 11 million views, and Dorothy Webb's voicemail, and the bird drawing still in her jacket pocket. "I want it to be different," she said. "For the next one. For the next child who gets on a plane alone. I want there to be a policy that actually protects her, not a brochure, not a FAQ page, an actual protocol with teeth." Claudette nodded slowly. "That's harder than a settlement," she said. "I know. They'll resist the binding policy changes. They'll offer cosmetic ones and call it progress." "Then we don't accept cosmetic ones." Claudette picked up her pen. "All right," she said, and she started a new page. Ava had been sent to school that morning, Maya's decision deliberate and firm. The worst thing Maya had decided was to let her daughter become the story's center of gravity, to have her sit at home watching herself on television, processing other people's processing of what she had experienced. School was normal. School was correct fractions, and a history quiz and lunch with friends who would not ask her how it felt to hold that boarding pass up to a man who didn't want to see it. School was the thing that belonged to Ava, untouched by any of this. But the school had called by 10:15. Not because anything was wrong. The principal, a careful woman named Dr. Elaine Foster, had called because 3 parents had reached out to her that morning, having recognized Ava's face in the screenshot being circulated online, asking whether the school needed to make a statement. Dr. Foster had told them politely and firmly that it did not. Then she had called Maya to give her a heads up. "She came in this morning like any other day," Dr. Foster said. "She turned in her history homework. She sat with her friends at breakfast. As far as I can tell, she's doing fine." Maya closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you," she said. "She's an exceptional kid, Dr. Carter. She really is." A pause. "The girls at her table, her friends, they were talking this morning when I walked by, about what she did on the plane, about how she didn't yell or cry or make a scene, just held up her boarding pass." Dr. Foster's voice had something in it that wasn't quite professional distance anymore. "One of them said, 'That's just how Ava is,' like it was the most natural thing in the world, like it was obvious." Maya didn't say anything for a moment. "Yeah," she said finally. "That's Ava." It was around noon when the second major development hit, and it hit with the specific force of something that had been quietly building for days and finally found its pressure point. A woman named Sandra Elliott, not the Sandra from the airline's unaccompanied minor desk, a different Sandra entirely posted a thread on social media that began, "I sat in 3C on that flight. I want to tell you what I saw that the video doesn't show." Sandra Elliott was 58 years old, a retired teacher from Richmond, Virginia, and she wrote the way retired teachers often write, with precision, with care, with a commitment to sequencing that made the whole thing read like testimony. She described Whitman's entrance. She described the exchange over the boarding pass. She described the words she had heard, not quite all of them, but enough. She described the moment Dorothy Webb had tapped Whitman on the shoulder. She described the applause after Captain Reeves spoke. And then she described something no one else had mentioned yet. She described the moment somewhere over North Carolina when she had seen Ava reach into her backpack and pull out her notebook and begin drawing again. Not because she was fine, Sandra wrote, but because that child had already decided that what he did was not going to take anything from her. She drew. She held her pencil, and she put it to paper, and she made something. Right there, in the seat next to the man who had told her she didn't belong. She made something beautiful. The thread had 400,000 retweets by 2 in the afternoon. Marcus Webb called Dorothy from his studio. "Did you see the thread?" "I wrote her this morning," Dorothy said. "After I saw the article. We've been texting since 10. "You know each other?" "We do now." Dorothy's voice had a particular satisfaction in it. "That's 4 of us from that cabin who've been in contact in the last 24 hours. Me, Sandra, you and a man named Gerald Park who was in 4A and says he has photos." Marcus sat up. "Photos more than the video. He didn't film it. He's not that kind of person," he said. "But he had his camera on his lap. He's a photographer, apparently professional, and he took 3 still shots of the exchange before he thought better of it. He says one of them is his word, definitive." "Has he shared them?" "Not yet. He's been sitting on them. He called me this morning because my number was in the thread comments, and he wanted to talk to someone who was actually there." A pause. "I think he's scared, Marcus. He doesn't want to be the one to pour more fuel on it. He wants to know it'll be used right." "It will be," Marcus said. "You don't know that." "Dorothy," his voice softened. "We were there. We know what happened. Whatever he has, it's not fuel. It's the record. And the record matters." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. "I'll call him back," she said. Gerald Park released the photographs at 3:47 in the afternoon through a short post that said, "Only I was in row 4. I'm a photographer. This is what I saw." He attached 3 images. The first showed the exchange in full Ava's arm, extended the boarding pass in her hand, Whitman looming above her, and in the corner of the frame visible just barely Dorothy's profile, watchful and still. The second was a close-up that Gerald had taken from a different angle, and it showed Whitman's face in a way the video had not the contempt in it, unmistakable, carved into the set of his jaw and the angle of his eyes. The third showed Ava from behind, small in the wide first-class seat, her notebook open on her tray table, the pencil moving. That third photograph broke something open in the public conversation that the video alone had not managed to break, because the video was 12 seconds of confrontation. But the photograph was a portrait of aftermath, a child who had been dismissed and was creating anyway, who had been told she didn't belong and was building something in the very space where they'd said she had no right to be. The comments on that photograph were different from the comments on the video. Less angry, quieter, something in them that was closer to grief. Keisha Monroe published her second piece at 5 o'clock. It was longer than the first 4,000 words meticulously sourced, and it contained the emails and the voicemail she had spent the last 2 days verifying. It documented a pattern, a conference remark in 2019, a complaint filed by a former subordinate in 2021 that had been settled and sealed, a meeting reported by 3 attendees in which Whitman had referred to a diversity hiring initiative as, in his words, lowering the bar. Each incident alone was deniable. Together, they formed a shape. And Keisha had rendered that shape with the patience of someone who understood that the facts assembled correctly spoke louder than any editorial voice she could lay over them. The piece went live. It was shared by Claudette Harris within 20 minutes with a single comment, "This is what pattern evidence looks like." The board meeting at Whitman's company ran 3 hours. When it ended, the company's communications team released a statement saying that Richard Whitman had stepped down from his position as Senior Vice President of Client Strategy, effective immediately pending an internal review. The statement did not use the word fired. It did not mention the video. It did not mention Ava Carter. But every person reading it knew exactly what it was about. Linda Chu, who had advised him not to say a word, watched the statement go out from her office and thought too late, too careful, and not nearly enough. She had been in this business for 22 years. She knew when a statement was designed to contain a fire and when the fire had already taken the building. This was the second kind. The statement would not calm anyone. It would generate a new round of coverage. Is this enough? Should there be more? What does accountability actually look like? And that coverage would circle back to the video, and the video would keep climbing, and Richard Whitman's face looming over a 10-year-old girl with a boarding pass in her outstretched hand would keep being the image people returned to when they tried to explain to each other what had happened and why it mattered. She called him one more time. "They put out the statement," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw." "Richard." She chose her next words carefully. "Whatever you decide to do next, whether you make a public statement, whether you reach out to the family, whether you go to ground entirely, I need you to understand something. That little girl did nothing wrong." She held up her boarding pass. "That's all she did. Whatever comes after this, that's the part you actually have to live with." The line was quiet. "I know," he said again. But knowing and reckoning are different countries, and Richard Whitman, sitting in his hotel room with the curtains drawn and the television off and his phone face down on the comforter, was still standing at the border between them, not yet willing to cross. At 6:15 that evening, Maya Carter's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. But something instinct or exhaustion or the reflexive alertness of a surgeon who has learned that the calls she almost misses are sometimes the ones that matter made her pick it up. "Dr. Carter," said the voice on the other end. It was a woman, older, with the kind of voice that has texture in it, that has absorbed a great deal and found ways to carry it gracefully. "My name is Senator Patricia Ann Walcott. I represent the state of Georgia. I've been watching what's happened in the last 2 days, and I'd like to have a conversation with you not as a public figure, not for the cameras, just as one mother to another. Because I think what happened to your daughter is about something bigger than one flight, and I think you know that too." Maya sat down slowly. She looked at the bird drawing still propped on the kitchen windowsill where she had put it that morning, the small penciled wings spread wide, the faint shadow below. "Yes," she said. "I do know that." "Then let's talk," Senator Walcott said, "because I think it's time something actually changed." Senator Patricia Ann Walcott was not the kind of politician who used other people's pain as currency. Maya had met enough of those in her career, the ones who showed up at hospital press conferences after mass casualty events with their staffers and their talking points and their carefully timed expressions of outrage, and then disappeared before the cleanup crews finished. Walcott was different. Maya had known that from the way she'd opened the call, not as a public figure, not for the cameras. Those words mattered. They were a signal. And Maya Carter had not survived 20 years in trauma medicine by ignoring signals. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes that first evening. Walcott had done her research, not just the headline version, not just the video and the Keisha Monroe articles, but the deeper material. She had read the hospital press release from 14 months ago. She had looked up the FAA's existing guidelines on unaccompanied minors, which were, as she described them, with a dry precision that Maya immediately respected, embarrassingly thin. She had already spoken to 2 colleagues on the Senate Commerce Committee, which had jurisdiction over aviation policy, and she had a question that she asked near the end of the call plainly and without preamble. "Dr. Carter, if you were designing the protection your daughter deserved on that flight, not what the policy manual says, but what actually should have been in place, what would it look like?" Maya had thought about this, actually thought about it, not just in the abstract outrage of the last 48 hours, but with the specific problem-solving part of her brain that she used in operating rooms. She had a list. She had written it on the back of a grocery receipt at 2 in the morning while Ava slept and the city was quiet, and the number under the video kept climbing. She read it to Walcott: mandatory first class or bulkhead seating adjacent to crew stations. A zero-tolerance policy for any passenger who disputes or verbally challenges an unaccompanied minor's seat assignment. Mandatory documentation of any incident involving an unaccompanied minor reported directly to the airline's Executive Safety Office within 24 hours. And a federal audit requirement every major carrier every 12 months reviewed for compliance. Walcott was quiet for a moment after Maya finished. "That last one," she said. "The audit. That's going to be the fight." "I know," Maya said. "The industry is going to push back hard on federal oversight. I know that too." "Are you prepared for this to be a long process?" Maya looked at the bird drawing on the windowsill. She had looked at it so many times in the past 2 days that she had begun to see it differently each time, not as a drawing, but as a statement. A small thing with wide wings casting a shadow on the world below it and flying anyway. "Senator Walcott," she said, "I've been a trauma surgeon for 20 years. I have stood in rooms where people told me a patient wasn't going to make it, and I have operated until the evidence changed. I know how long processes work." Walcott made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but came from the same place. "All right," she said, "let's get to work." The meeting with the airline the following morning was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Maya arrived at 8:50 with Claudette Harris, who walked into the conference room with a legal pad, a recorder, and the composed, watchful energy of a woman who had spent 20 years making corporations deeply uncomfortable about things they would have preferred to leave unexamined. David Morse was already there with 3 other people: the airline's general counsel, their head of customer experience, and a woman introduced as their director of operations standards, whose job title Maya suspected had been created sometime in the last 48 hours specifically for this meeting. They had coffee and a fruit tray arranged on the side table. Nobody touched it. Morse opened with the apology. It was polished, clearly drafted and revised by people who did this professionally, and it hit all the right notes: acknowledgement, regret, commitment to change. Maya listened to all of it without moving. When he finished, she said, "Thank you. I appreciate the statement. Now I want to talk about what comes after it." Claudette slid a document across the table. Morse's counsel picked it up. A flicker crossed his face as he read, not quite surprised because he had been anticipating something, but the particular recalibration of a lawyer who has underestimated the other side. "This is quite comprehensive," he said. "It's meant to be," Claudette said. The document was 8 pages. It outlined in precise legal language every item on the list Maya had read to Senator Walcott the night before, plus 3 additional provisions that Claudette had added a mandatory retraining program for all frontline crew on de-escalation involving minors, a public-facing dashboard reporting unaccompanied minor incidents across all routes, and a direct communication protocol guaranteeing that parents of unaccompanied minors would receive a personal call, not a form letter, within 2 hours of any incident. The room was quiet for a long moment. "Dr. Carter," Morse said finally, "I want to be clear that we are committed to meaningful reform, but some of these provisions, particularly the public-facing dashboard and the audit requirement, are going to require board approval, and the timeline—" "Mr. Morse!" Maya's voice was level and entirely without apology. "Yesterday morning, your airline had 29 million people watching a video of a passenger harassing my unaccompanied 10-year-old daughter in a seat she had paid for in a cabin your crew was responsible for. By this afternoon, Senator Walcott's office will be issuing a statement indicating that she is opening a formal inquiry into federal oversight of unaccompanied minor protocols across all major carriers. I am one of the subjects of that inquiry. Your airline is another. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm offering you the opportunity to be ahead of what's coming instead of behind it." Another silence. Longer this time. Morse looked at his counsel. His counsel looked at the document. The director of operations standards, who had not spoken yet, was looking at Maya with an expression that was harder to read, something between professional respect and the slightly stunned quality of a person watching a situation develop faster than their briefing had prepared them for. "Give us until end of business today," Morse said. "You have until 3 o'clock, Claudette said, and she recapped her pen. They walked out of the building at 9:47. On the sidewalk, Claudette exhaled slowly. "That went well," she said. "You think so?" Maya said. The counsel's face when he read the dashboard provision. Claudette almost smiled. That's the face of a man doing math very fast. He knows they can't fight this in public. Not now, not with the visibility it has. She glanced at Maya. "Walcott called you back this morning, didn't she?" "At 7:15. What did she say? She said the inquiry statement would go out at 1 o'clock this afternoon and that she wanted me to know before it hit the news. Claudette nodded slowly. She's good. She's very good, Maya agreed. The inquiry statement from Senator Walcott's office landed at 1:03 in the afternoon, and it moved through the news cycle with the clean, directed force of something that had been carefully aimed. It announced a formal Senate inquiry into federal protections for unaccompanied minors on commercial flights, cited the incident involving Ava Carter by name, and called on all major carriers to submit their current protocols to the Commerce Committee within 30 days. It was 2 paragraphs long. It didn't need to be longer. The airline called at 2:41. Morse's voice had changed. The polish was still there, but underneath it something had compressed the way a voice compresses when the latitude has narrowed, and the person speaking knows it. "Dr. Carter," he said, "we've completed our internal review and we're prepared to accept the framework as presented with 2 modifications to the implementation timeline on the dashboard provision. Our counsel will send the revised document to Ms. Harris within the hour." Maya was standing in her kitchen. She put one hand flat on the counter. "And the policy changes will be publicly announced." "Yes, we're scheduling a press conference for tomorrow morning and we'd like—" "I won't be attending the press conference," Maya said. "This isn't about optics for me, it's about the policy. As long as the policy is what it says it is, we're aligned." A pause. "I understand," Morse said. "Dr. Carter, for what it's worth, this organization is genuinely going to be better because of this." Maya thought about what to say to that for a moment. "Make sure it is," she said, and hung up. She called Claudette. They agreed. Claudette's exhale was audible. "All of it. 2 timeline modifications on the dashboard, everything else intact." "Maya," a pause. This is going to matter. Not just for the airline. Once it's in Walcott's inquiry, every carrier is going to be looking at this framework. This becomes the standard. Maya sat down at the kitchen table. She felt suddenly the full weight of the last 72 hours, not dramatically, not in a rush of emotion, but in the way exhaustion arrives after the crisis has passed, the slow unwinding of everything that had been held at tension. "Claudette," she said quietly, "when I booked that seat, I booked it because I wanted her to be close to the flight attendants. I didn't book it because I thought she would need protecting from another passenger. I thought I had thought of everything." "You couldn't have thought of everything," Claudette said. "No." Maya looked at the bird drawing, but she was ready anyway. There was a part of the story that was happening at the same time in a register that the press conferences and the Senate inquiry and the policy negotiations couldn't quite touch, and it was happening in the in-between spaces, in text threads and phone calls, and a corner booth of a diner in Birmingham, Alabama, where Dorothy Webb was sitting across from her granddaughter, a 16-year-old named Chloe, showing her the bird drawing on her phone. "She gave it to you," Chloe said. "Handed it right to me," Dorothy said. "Like it was nothing, like giving something beautiful away is just what you do." Chloe looked at the photograph of the drawing for a long time. She was 16 with her grandmother's eyes and a generation's worth of additional wariness, the kind that comes from growing up online, from having seen enough cycles of outrage and forgetting to be skeptical of both. "Grandma," she said, "do you think anything's actually going to change? Or is this just going to be the thing everyone talks about for 2 weeks and then it's gone?" Dorothy picked up her coffee. "I think Ava's mother is making sure it's not gone," she said. "And I think Senator Walcott means what she says. And I think the people who were on that plane, Marcus and Sandra and Gerald and me, we're going to keep talking about it. We're not going to let it go quiet." She set the cup down. "But you know what I really think is going to make it stick?" "What?" "That drawing." Dorothy looked at her granddaughter. "Because photographs fade and news cycles move and policy language gets watered down in committee and people forget. But that drawing a bird with wide wings still flying with a shadow underneath it that stays with you, that's the kind of thing people carry." Chloe looked at the photograph again. "Can I share it?" "It's already been shared," Dorothy said. "Gerald photographed it before she gave it to me. It's been everywhere for 2 days." She paused. "But you can share it again if you want. Some things need to keep moving. Gerald Park's photograph of the drawing had in fact taken on a life entirely separate from the rest of the story. It had been shared by artists and educators and parents and teachers and people who had nothing to do with aviation policy, but recognized something in it that went beyond the incident. A mural had appeared overnight on a wall in Atlanta. The bird scaled up to 20 feet. Wings spread the shadow below it, careful and precise, faithful to the original pencil lines. Someone had taken a photograph of the mural and posted it, and that photograph had spread faster than any of the news coverage, because it spoke in a language that didn't require context, that didn't require knowing the names or the seat numbers or the airline or the senator. It just required eyes. Ava had seen the photograph of the mural on her mother's phone that evening. She had looked at it without saying anything for a long moment. Then she said, "They made it big." "They did," Maya said. "My bird," Ava said. And there was something in her voice that was not quite pride, something quieter than pride, more internal. The particular satisfaction of a person who has made something and then watched it become more than what they made it. "I just drew it because I needed to do something with my hands," she said, while he was sitting there. Maya looked at her. "What do you mean, when he said what he said about kids like me?" Ava's voice was matter-of-fact, the way children can be matter-of-fact about things that cost adults enormous effort to process. "I knew I couldn't yell. I knew I couldn't argue. You always say if you can't change the room, change what you're doing in it. So I drew." Maya was very still. "I say that all the time." Ava looked at her mother with a 10-year-old's direct, slightly impatient certainty. "When you're in a bad surgery, you always say it to yourself. I can hear you through the study door when you're debriefing." Maya stared at her daughter. She had not known Ava could hear her through the door. She had not known that the things she said in those late-night debriefs to herself, she had thought, just processing, just working through the weight of the day, had been absorbed by the child sleeping down the hall, had become part of the architecture of how Ava moved through hard rooms. The realization moved through her with a force she hadn't expected, not grief, not regret exactly, but something like awe, the recognition that children are listening even when you don't know you're teaching. "You remembered that," Maya said. "I remember everything you say," Ava said with complete simplicity, and went back to her homework. The press conference the next morning was held at the airline's D.C. offices. The CEO, a trim, carefully spoken man named Alan Jeffries, stood at a podium and announced the policy changes with the specific language Claudette had insisted on, not "we are committed to exploring" or "we plan to develop," but effective immediately, and mandatory, and publicly reported. 3 camera crews and 11 print journalists were in the room. The statement ran 4 minutes and 30 seconds. At the end, a reporter asked whether Dr. Carter had been involved in shaping the new policies. Jeffries said yes. Another reporter asked whether the airline believed the incident constituted racial discrimination. Jeffries paused. His communications team seated to the left of the podium shifted almost imperceptibly. "We believe," Jeffrey said carefully, "that a child was treated in a manner inconsistent with her dignity and her documented right to her seat. We believe the pattern of behavior directed toward her was unacceptable. And we believe these policy changes address the systemic gaps that allowed that behavior to go unchallenged for as long as it did." He did not say the word race, but the answer hung in the room in a way that everyone present understood was not an evasion, but a recognition that the legal language and the human reality were 2 different things, and that the policy changes mattered regardless of which language you used to describe what had happened. Patricia Nguyen watched the press conference from her apartment alone with a mug of tea she had poured and not drunk. When it ended, she called James. "You watching?" she said. "Just finished," he said. "They said our names," Patricia said. "In the policy announcement. They cited our response as, what was the phrase, the model of appropriate crew intervention that this policy codifies." "I heard." She was quiet for a moment. "We did the right thing," she said. "We just did what we were supposed to do." "Yeah," James said. "But sometimes that's the hard thing, and somebody needs to say it was hard." A pause. Captain Reeves called me this morning. He got a letter from Ava. Patricia set down her mug. He did try handwritten, 3 paragraphs. She thanked him for kneeling down to talk to her, said it made her feel like a real person and not a problem. James's voice had something in it that required a moment to place. He read me the last line. She wrote, "Most grown-ups talk over my head. You talked into my eyes. That was the right thing." Patricia didn't say anything for a moment. "She's 10 years old," she said finally. "I know," James said. "I know." The letter to Captain Reeves was not the only one Ava had written. She had written one to Dorothy Webb, care of the email address Dorothy had included in her original voicemail to Maya, which Maya had shared with Ava after asking whether she wanted to respond. She had written one to Marcus Webb, thanking him for not looking away. She had written one to Sandra Elliott, whose thread she had read with her mother, and which had made her put her hand flat on the kitchen table and say quietly, "She really saw me." And she had written one, the most difficult one, the one she had rewritten 4 times before she was satisfied to Gerald Park about the photograph of her drawing. That letter said, "I didn't know anyone took a picture of it. I gave it to Dorothy because she was kind, and I wanted her to have something. I didn't know it would get big, but I think maybe things get big when they're true. The bird is true. Thank you for keeping the true thing." Gerald Park framed that letter. He hung it in his studio beside the photograph of the bird drawing, and whenever people came in and asked about it, he told them the whole story. Every time. All of it. Because some things need to keep moving, and stories are one of the ways that happens. Richard Whitman issued a public statement 12 days after the incident. It was a page long and had clearly been written by someone other than him, though his name was on it. It used the words "deeply regret" and "reflect on my actions" and "I recognize the harm." It did not mention Ava by name. It did not mention race. It said he had begun working with a diversity and inclusion consultant, which generated its own separate news cycle, shorter and colder, the sound of a public that had largely made its decision and was not particularly interested in updating it. Maya read the statement once. She did not respond to the 17 interview requests that asked for her reaction. She sent the statement to Claudette, who sent back a single text. "Not enough, but not nothing. Keep going, keep going." That was the operating principle. The Senate inquiry was underway. 3 other major carriers had preemptively requested meetings with Walcott's staff to discuss their own unaccompanied minor protocols, which meant the policy framework was already spreading before the inquiry had formally compelled it to. A parents' advocacy group in Chicago had adopted Claudette's document as a template for a broader campaign. A law school clinic at Howard University had reached out to Claudette about using the case in their civil rights curriculum. And in a 3rd-grade classroom in Atlanta, not Ava's school, a different school entirely on the other side of the city, a teacher named Ms. Renee had printed out Gerald's photograph of the bird drawing and pinned it to the bulletin board beside a question she had written in block letters on an index card. The question said, "What do you make when you can't change the room?" The children had been putting their answers on sticky notes below the photograph all week. By Thursday, the board was covered in them. Small handwriting, uneven letters, the particular earnestness of 8-year-olds who haven't yet learned to be cynical about their own answers. One sticky note in green crayon said, "I make something true." Ms. Renee didn't know whose answer that was. She had stepped out for a moment when some of them were writing, and when she came back, the note was already there, anonymous among all the others. But she left it where it was. She left all of them. And at the end of the week, when a parent volunteer came in to help update the bulletin board, for the new month, Ms. Renee said gently but firmly, "Leave that one. That one stays." 3 weeks after the flight, Ava Carter went back to school on a Monday morning and asked her teacher if she could present something to the class. Her teacher, a gentle, perceptive woman named Ms. Diane, said yes, without asking what it was. She had learned in the month since the story had broken that Ava did not make requests without reason, that when this child asked for something, it was because she had already thought through it with a thoroughness that most adults reserved for decisions far larger than a classroom presentation. So she said yes, and she moved the morning schedule, and she sat in the back of the room while Ava stood at the front with no notes, no poster, no visual aid except the small notebook she carried everywhere. Ava told the story herself, not the version that had 30 million views, not the version that had been parsed by journalists and senators and corporate communications teams, her version. The version that started with her mother's voice at the kitchen table 3 nights before the flight, running through scenarios, saying know your worth even when they try to make you forget it. The version that included the apple juice Patricia had brought her and the way Captain Reeves had knelt down and talked into her eyes. The version where Dorothy clapped, unhurried and deliberate, and the sound of it had felt like something solid in a moment when everything else felt like it was tilting. She talked for 11 minutes. The room was absolutely still. When she finished, a boy named Marcus, not the photographer, a different Marcus, 8 years old, with glasses that were always slightly crooked, raised his hand and said, "Were you scared?" Ava thought about it for a real moment, not a polished one. "Yes," she said, "but I did it scared. There's a difference." Ms. Diane in the back of the room pressed her lips together briefly and looked at the ceiling. That same morning, 60 miles away in Washington, D.C., Senator Walcott's staff was finalizing the language for what had become known internally as the Carter Provision, the section of a broader aviation safety bill that codified mandatory federal protections for unaccompanied minors on commercial flights. The language had gone through 11 drafts. Claudette Harris had been on 3 conference calls in the previous week alone, pushing back on the diluted wording the industry lobbying group had proposed, restoring specificity, where committees had softened it, holding the line on the audit requirement that the carriers had pushed hardest to remove. On the 12th draft, the audit requirement was still there. Claudette sent Maya a text at 9:47 that morning. It said language holds, call you at noon. Maya was in surgery. She didn't see the text until 12:30 when she walked out of the OR, still in her gloves, and found 2 missed calls from Claudette, and one from a number she recognized as Senator Walcott's direct line. She called Claudette first. "The bill is going to committee this week," Claudette said. "Walcott has the votes. The audit provision is in. The mandatory incident documentation is in. The crew protocol training is in." She paused. "Maya, this is real. This is actually happening." Maya leaned against the wall of the corridor, still in scrubs, the sounds of the hospital moving around her. "The dashboard," she said. "The public-facing reporting. Modified slightly on the rollout timeline, 18 months instead of 12, but it's in the bill. Mandatory, not voluntary. Every carrier." Maya closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her jaw had the set of someone who has held a position under pressure for a long time and is only just beginning to feel the pressure ease. "Claudette," she said, "when this passes," when Claudette confirmed, not if, when. "When it passes, I want to make sure the people who were on that plane know. Dorothy and Marcus and Sandra and Gerald. They were witnesses and they chose to stay witnesses. They chose not to look away. That matters." "I'll make sure they know," Claudette said. "Walcott wants to invite them to D.C. for the signing if it goes through. She mentioned it last week. She wants the people who were in the room to be in the room when it becomes law." Maya thought about Dorothy's voicemail. That steady, precise voice, "If you decide to do something about this, I will stand right beside you." "Yes," she said. "Tell Walcott, yes." The twist that no one in the public conversation had anticipated, the one that shifted the story's final register entirely, the one that Keisha Monroe published on a Thursday afternoon 4 weeks after the incident, did not come from the airline or the Senate or Richard Whitman's office. It came from a woman named Carolyn Reyes, who was 44 years old and lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and whose daughter, a 7-year-old named Priya, had been an unaccompanied minor on a domestic flight 2 years earlier. Carolyn had watched the video of Ava. She had watched it the way millions of people watched it first, with anger. Then, with the particular exhaustion of recognition, the feeling of seeing something you have already lived rendered visible to people who had not lived it. She had shared it. She had commented. She had moved on the way you do when the news cycle is relentless and your own life requires your attention. And then Keisha Monroe had reached her. Keisha had been following threads the way she always did, tracking the tributaries that flow off major stories, and one of those tributaries had led to a year-old post in a parenting forum where a woman named Carolyn had described in careful detail an incident on a flight where a flight attendant had moved her unaccompanied 7-year-old from a confirmed seat without explanation, relocated her to a middle seat in economy between two strangers, and when Carolyn had filed a formal complaint, had been told there was no documentation of any incident because no incident report had been filed. No report, because no protocol required one. Keisha had called Carolyn. Carolyn had talked for 2 hours. Her story had every element of Ava's story, except the video, except the diamond status businessman, except the public moment of confrontation. And because it had none of those things, because it had happened quietly and privately and without witnesses, it had gone nowhere. The complaint had been closed. The airline had offered miles. Priya was 9 now and still asked every time they went to the airport whether she was going to have to sit next to people she didn't know. The piece Keisha published that Thursday was titled, "Before Ava, There Was Priya," and 100 others who never made the news. It ran 6,000 words. It documented 7 cases, 7 families, 7 unaccompanied minors, 7 incidents across 5 different airlines spanning 8 years. Different ages, different routes, different carriers, different specific circumstances. One pattern: a child alone, vulnerable, subject to decisions made by adults in positions of authority, with no mandatory documentation, no parental notification requirement, no federal oversight, no accountability structure that could be independently verified. The piece went live at 2 in the afternoon. By 4, it had been shared by every major civil rights organization that had been following the Carter story. By 5, Senator Walcott's press secretary had issued a statement saying the cases documented in the article would be included in the Senate inquiry's evidentiary record. By 6, 3 of the other families Keisha had written about had received calls from Claudette Harris's office asking whether they wanted to be represented in the legislative process. All 3 said yes. Maya read the piece at her kitchen table that evening, with Ava doing homework beside her. When she finished, she sat for a moment without speaking. Ava looked up from her worksheet. "What is it?" Ava asked. "Something Keisha Monroe wrote," Maya said. She turned the laptop so Ava could see the headline. Ava read it. Her face did something careful and quiet. "There were other kids," she said. "Yes." "Before me." "Yes." Ava looked at the screen for a long moment. "That's why it matters," she said. "Not just me, all of them." Maya looked at her daughter, at this child who had flown alone for the first time 3 weeks ago and had come home carrying more than any 10-year-old should have to carry, and who had somehow, through the combination of her mother's training and her own particular native steadiness, turned that weight into something that moved forward instead of pressing down. "Yes," Maya said, "all of them." Ava nodded. Then she said with the direct practicality that was so entirely hers, "Mom, can I write to Priya?" Maya blinked. "To Carolyn's daughter." "She's 7. She's still scared of airports." Ava's voice was matter-of-fact and entirely serious. "Maybe it would help, from another kid, not from a grown-up." Maya sat back in her chair. She thought about how to respond to that for a moment, and then she decided she didn't need to respond to it at all. She just said, "Yes, I think that would mean a great deal." Ava tore a clean page from her notebook. She picked up a pencil, and she started to write. The Senate vote came 6 weeks later. It was not unanimous. Nothing in the Senate is unanimous, but the margin was larger than Walcott's team had projected, which meant the industry pushback had been less effective than the carriers had counted on, which meant the public visibility of the Carter case had shifted the political math in ways that were now in the formal language of the congressional record permanent. The bill passed on a Tuesday afternoon. Claudette was in the gallery. Dorothy Webb had flown in from Birmingham and was sitting 2 seats to Claudette's left, her hands folded in her lap, perfectly composed, the way she had been composed in row 4 of that first-class cabin when she set down her crossword and decided to pay attention. Marcus Webb was beside her, no relation, and they had laughed about it every time they introduced themselves to someone new. Sandra Elliott was there, and Gerald Park with his camera, and Carolyn Reyes with her daughter Priya, who was 9 years old and wearing a yellow dress and who held her mother's hand with a grip that was a little tighter than the situation required, but that her mother did not once try to loosen. Maya Carter was not in the gallery. She had been invited. She had chosen not to come. She was in Atlanta. She was at the hospital in the middle of a 12-hour shift because a 41-year-old man had been brought in at 7 in the morning with injuries that required her particular set of skills and her particular refusal to leave a trauma bay before the patient was stable. This was what she did. This was who she was. The policy work and the Senate inquiry and the 30 million views and the articles and the letters, all of it was real. All of it mattered, and none of it was what she woke up every morning to do. She woke up to do this. She woke up to stand in rooms where people were breaking and to use her hands to help put them back together. Claudette sent her a text at 2:17. It passed. Maya was between procedures. She read it in the corridor. She put her phone back in her pocket. She stood still for exactly 10 seconds. Then she walked back into the OR. The text she sent back 2 hours later, when she finally had a moment, said, "Tell Dorothy. Tell all of them. Tell them thank you." Claudette showed Dorothy the text in the gallery hallway after the session ended. Dorothy read it. She handed the phone back without speaking. Then she looked up at the high ceiling of the Senate building, and something moved across her face. Not quite tears, but whatever is located just adjacent to them, the place where relief and grief and gratitude and the long, slow weight of accumulated injustice finally find somewhere to land. "She was operating," Claudette said quietly. "Of course she was," Dorothy said. And the way she said it contained everything. The recognition of a woman who had spent 72 years watching how much black women are required to carry and still carry it and still show up and still do the work, even when the work is never only one thing, never contained, never finished. They flew home separately. But before they left the building, Gerald Park gathered them in the marble hallway and said, "Can I?" And when they all said yes, he took a photograph. Not a formal one. He wasn't interested in formal ones, had never been interested in them, but the kind he had always preferred, the kind where people are looking at each other rather than the camera, where what's being documented is not the event, but the relationship between the people who witnessed it. Dorothy and Claudette and Marcus and Sandra and Carolyn with Priya in her yellow dress, all standing in a cluster mid-conversation, mid-laugh, mid-something, that Gerald's practiced eye recognized as the particular light that comes into people's faces when something hard has ended and something real has taken its place. That photograph would run alongside Keisha Monroe's final piece on the story, published 3 days later. It was the capstone of a series that had won her, in the months that followed, 2 major journalism awards, and the kind of professional recognition that her editor Frank had predicted, and she had barely let herself imagine. But she didn't know that yet. She just knew she had a story to close, and she closed it the way she always closed the ones that mattered. Not with analysis, not with policy language, not with the names of senators or airline executives or corporate communications officers, but with people. With the specific, irreducible reality of individual human beings who had been in a room together and had made a choice about what to do while they were there. She called Ava for the piece. She had asked Maya's permission first, which Maya had given with one condition: Ava would only answer questions she wanted to answer, and she would tell Keisha herself if a question crossed a line. Keisha had agreed immediately. They talked for 40 minutes. Ava was as advertised remarkable, not in a performed way, not in the way of a child who has been coached and rehearsed, but in the way of a person who has processed something genuinely difficult and come through it with her understanding of the world expanded rather than diminished. She talked about the flight. She talked about the boarding pass. She talked about Dorothy clapping. She talked about drawing the bird. And then Keisha asked her the question she had been saving for last. Ava, when you look back at that day, not at what it became, not the video or the policy or any of that, but just that day on that plane, is there anything you would do differently? Ava thought about it for a real unhurried moment. No, she said. Nothing. I showed him my boarding pass. I stayed in my seat. I didn't yell. I asked for help when I needed it. I drew something. She paused. I think that was right. All of it. I think when somebody tries to make you smaller, you stay your size. You don't get smaller and you don't try to get bigger. You just stay exactly who you are and you let that be enough. Keisha typed that without looking at her keyboard. That's a lot of wisdom for 10 years old, she said. My mom says wisdom doesn't come from age, Ava said. It comes from paying attention. I pay attention. Keisha published those words verbatim. She had the instinct briefly to paraphrase them, to work them into her own prose, to absorb them into her authorial voice the way journalists sometimes do with the best material they collect. But she decided against it. Some things should not be translated. Some things arrive in their final form already complete, requiring nothing from anyone except the willingness to pass them along unchanged. Captain Daniel Reeves received his formal commendation from the airline in a brief internal ceremony that he attended in his uniform and left in his uniform, returning directly to the flight line because there was a Chicago route in 2 hours and he was scheduled to fly it. He kept the commendation letter in the same drawer as Ava's handwritten note, the one that said, "You talked into my eyes," and he thought about her sometimes when he walked through the first-class cabin before a flight, looking at the faces in the seats, the people settling in for however long the journey took, each one carrying something he couldn't see and didn't know. He thought about the look on her face when he had knelt down beside her, the way she had said thank you, simple and complete, like a person who had practiced receiving care gracefully and knew how to do it without diminishing it. He did not think of himself as having done anything exceptional. He had done his job. He had protected a passenger. He had told the truth plainly to a man who needed to hear it in a room full of people who needed to see it said. But on the days when the job felt like routine, when the altitudes and the checklists and the boarding announcements all ran together into the comfortable blur of deep familiarity, he would think about that flight and the way the applause had moved through the cabin row by row, and the girl at the window with her pencil and her notebook, drawing a bird with wide wings in the seat next to the man who had said she didn't belong, and he would think that's why you do it right every time, because any one of them might be her. Any one of them might be someone who needs to look up and see an adult in a uniform who is going to tell them the truth. James Calloway applied for a crew training certification 8 months after the incident. It was a program he had been thinking about for years, moving from cabin service into crew development, training new flight attendants in de-escalation, in the specific underappreciated skill of reading a situation before it becomes a confrontation. He had thought about it before, but the flight from Atlanta had clarified something for him that thinking alone had not managed to clarify, that the skills that had let him and Patricia and Captain Reeves protect Ava were not universal, were not automatic, were not things every crew member would bring to that situation, without training. That specifically named what they were and why they mattered. He was accepted into the program on the first application. Patricia Nguyen attended his certification ceremony. She brought flowers yellow, which she knew he would find slightly embarrassing and which she found extremely funny, and she sat in the third row and clapped when his name was called, with the unhurried, deliberate satisfaction of someone who has decided that some moments deserve to be marked properly, regardless of whether the person being marked would prefer a quieter acknowledgement. Afterward at the dinner James's family had organized, Patricia sat beside his mother, who was 81 years old and had not entirely understood what the whole story was about until James's sister explained it to her, and then had understood it completely and immediately, the way people who have spent their lives navigating the same terrain always recognize its map. His mother had taken Patricia's hand at the table and said, "You protected a child that wasn't yours. That's the oldest kind of goodness there is." Patricia had not been able to answer that for a moment. Then she said, "She didn't need much protecting. She was already doing fine." "I know," James's mother said, "but it mattered that you tried. Ava turned 11 4 months after the flight. Maya made her a cake chocolate with vanilla frosting, which had been Ava's request since she was 4, and showed no signs of changing. And they ate it at the kitchen table with Claudette, who had come over with a book and a card, and with Ava's best friend from school, a serious, funny girl named Tommy, who had known Ava since kindergarten, and who was constitutionally incapable of making a big deal about anything, which was exactly what Ava needed on a day when the rest of the world had been making a large deal about her for 4 months. After dinner, after Tommy had gone home, and Claudette had said goodnight, and the kitchen had been cleaned, and the leftover cake put away, Ava sat at the table with her notebook. Maya was doing the dishes her back to the room, the comfortable sound of water and plates, and she heard the scratch of the pencil but didn't look. She knew the rhythm of it. She had been listening to it for years, the particular pace of her daughter drawing unhurried and deliberate, the sound of someone who is putting something true onto paper. After a while, Ava said, "Mom, do you think the kids who come after me, the ones who fly alone, do you think they'll be okay now, with the new rules?" Maya turned off the water. She dried her hands. She came to the table and sat down across from her daughter. Ava had drawn something new, not a bird this time, or not only a bird. It was a whole sky, and in it were birds of different sizes, different shapes, all moving in the same direction, their shadows falling on a landscape far below them, small and specific and full of detail. "I think they'll have more protection than you did," Maya said carefully. "I think there will be protocols and reporting requirements and trained crews who know what to do. I think it will be better." She paused. "And I think injustice is creative. I think it finds new forms when you close old ones. So no, I don't think the rules alone will make everything okay. Rules don't do that by themselves." Ava looked at her. "Then what does—" Maya looked at the drawing, the sky full of birds with shadows all going forward together. "People who pay attention," she said. "People who don't look away. People who sit in row 4 and tap a stranger on the shoulder. People who take 12 seconds of video because something is wrong and they know it. People who write the story and keep writing it until the right people hear it." She looked at her daughter. "And 10-year-old girls who stay their size when someone tries to make them smaller." Ava was quiet for a moment. Then she pushed the drawing across the table. "For you," she said. "Birthday present, except it's not my birthday." Maya picked it up. She looked at it for a long time, the sky, the birds, the shadows, the landscape below. The whole thing rendered in pencil with the precision and confidence of a child who has learned that what she makes has weight in the world. She held it to her chest. Some stories end in courtrooms or congressional chambers in signed legislation and formal commendations and the efficient language of institutional accountability. This one did those things. It produced a federal law. It changed the protocols of an industry. It ended a career and trained a generation of crew members and put a bird on a wall in Atlanta that people still stop to look at years later without always knowing what it meant. But the truest end of this story, the one that mattered most, was a woman holding a drawing at a kitchen table on an ordinary evening in Atlanta, while her daughter sat across from her with a pencil and a notebook, and the quiet, unshakable certainty of someone who knows that the sky is large enough for all the birds in it, and that flying with a shadow beneath you is not a diminishment. It is simply the truth of what it means to fly at all. And Ava Carter, 11 years old, had known that before anyone thought to ask her. She had known it at 30,000 feet in seat 2A with a boarding pass in her hand and a pencil in her pocket, and a mother's voice in her head saying, "Know your worth, even when they try to make you forget it." She had known it. She had held it. She had flown,